He was born not just as a prince but as a prophecy. From the very beginning, Alexander of Macedon was raised not to live an ordinary life but to carve his name into eternity. His mother, Olympias, fed him stories that he was not the son of King Philip II, but of Zeus himself. His tutor, Aristotle, filled his young mind with the legends of Achilles and Hercules, heroes who were not content with mortal limits. Alexander did not simply want to rule. He wanted to transcend. And he believed it was his destiny. By the time most men were finding their purpose, Alexander had already conquered Greece. At just 20 years old, he inherited his father's throne and immediately launched himself into history's most ambitious military campaign. He crossed into Asia not as a king seeking tribute, but as a god-in-waiting seeking validation. His army followed him with fear, loyalty, and awe, for he did not merely command battles, he reshaped reality. At the Battle of Issus, he charged directly at Darius III of Persia, forcing the great king to flee. At Tyre, when the island fortress refused to surrender, Alexander built an entire causeway across the sea to reach it. When storms tore it down, he rebuilt it. Nothing stopped him. Every impossible task became proof of his divine mission. But Alexander was not just a warrior. He was a paradox. Brutally ruthless one moment, deeply philosophical the next. He could burn cities to the ground in fury, then weep over the death of a loyal friend. He wore the armor of Achilles yet held scrolls of Homer beneath his pillow. He led his soldiers through scorching deserts, eating the same rations they did, marching on foot beside them to share their fatigue. To his men, he was not merely a leader. He was a force of nature. His ambition knew no limits. Egypt crowned him pharaoh and declared him the son of Ammonius. Persia bowed and named him king of kings. He adopted the customs of those he conquered, not to show submission, but to prove that he was no longer bound by ethnicity or nation. He was becoming something beyond human. When his generals objected to him demanding obedience like a god, he did not back down. He believed worship was not arrogance. To him, it was recognition. But this transformation came at a cost. The more he grew into legend, the more he drifted from humanity. He pushed his army to the edge of the world, reaching India, where even elephants marched into battle against him. His body was covered in scars, broken ribs, deep wounds, arrow injuries, and gashes that never fully healed. Each victory left him stronger in myth and weaker in flesh. He drank heavily, wine flowed through his campaigns as ruthlessly as blood. Celebrations of triumph turned into nights of excess. In one drunken rage, he killed Clitus the Black, a lifelong friend who had once saved his life. When the wine cleared from his mind, Alexander fell into despair, locking himself away for days in grief and guilt. His godlike image was cracking, revealing a tortured man behind it. Yet he kept moving forward. He founded more than 20 cities, all bearing his name. But he could never settle in any of them. Conquest was not his means. It was his identity. He believed that to stop was to die. At the height of his power, he began planning his next campaign, Arabia, then Carthage, then Rome. His empire stretched across 3 continents, and still he wanted more. There was no boundary that satisfied him. But power breeds enemies, and divinity breeds resentment. His generals whispered among themselves, fearing they would be discarded in his next wave of ambition. His old Macedonian companions resented his new Persian courtiers. Some believed he had gone mad with glory. Others believed he was truly blessed by the gods and untouchable. The line between worship and fear blurred. Some bowed to him willingly. Others did so because defiance meant death. Behind the cheers and ceremonies, a shadow of betrayal began to take form. This was not merely a king. This was a man who refashioned himself into a deity, and demanded the world acknowledge it. His body was mortal, yes, but his belief in his own immortality was unshakable. He once said that toil and danger are the price of greatness. He paid that price every day, not knowing how soon the invoice for his divinity would come due. For a man who believed he was born of gods, death was not part of the plan. But as history would soon show, even the greatest conqueror could not conquer his final enemy, his own mortality. The world had seen him rise like a storm. Now it would witness how gods fall. Babylon was not just a city, it was a symbol. A jewel of the ancient world, drenched in gold, music, incense, and temptation. When Alexander arrived there in 323 BCE, he was not merely returning from war. He was arriving as a living god to a city prepared to worship him. Streets were lined with dancers. Musicians played for days. Exotic animals were paraded through markets in his honor. Gold was poured onto the roads so his horses' hooves would not touch common ground. Babylon welcomed him like Olympus would welcome Zeus. Yet behind the celebrations, something darker brewed. Alexander entered the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, a colossal structure of towering halls, shimmering blue walls, and lush gardens dripping with fragrance. The same place where ancient kings once ruled now belonged to him. But this was not to be a calm return. It was to be a celebration worthy of legend. He announced a massive banquet, a feast not just of food but of power. Delegations came from every corner of his empire, Persians in silk robes, Greeks in bronze armor, Egyptians wrapped in gold-threaded linen. Even his most distant commanders gathered. But with them came tension. Some were loyal. Others were jealous. Some bowed to him as a god. Others clenched their fists behind their backs, remembering when he was merely mortal. The banquet hall glittered with silver and torches. Endless tables were filled with roasted lamb, figs, honeyed bread, dates soaked in wine, and spices from India. Musicians played softly in the background as dancers moved elegantly between the guests. But Alexander didn't come to dine quietly. No, he came to dominate even celebration. The drinking began early. In Macedonian tradition, feasting was not complete without wine, strong, undiluted, burning like fire. Alexander lifted his cup and toasted to future conquests, Arabia, then beyond. Some cheered loudly. Others exchanged glances. He was already planning new wars before recovering from the old ones. His thirst for expansion was unquenchable. So was his thirst for wine. Beside him sat Medius of Larissa, one of his companions. Ancient accounts say it was Medius who invited Alexander to a smaller private drinking party after the feast, one that would soon become infamous. Some believed it was innocent companionship. Others suspected it was a trap. They reclined on couches, as was custom, wine flowing endlessly from golden bowls. Alexander was already exhausted from years of battle, his body scarred, his liver overworked. Yet he continued drinking as if defying mortality itself. At one point, it said he grabbed a massive cup known as the Heracles cup, a vessel so large that even seasoned warriors avoided it, and declared he would drain it in one breath. Those who watched gasped. To most, it was a display of strength. To others, it was suicide. When he finished, he reportedly screamed in pain, sharp, sudden, as if struck from within. He clutched his side. Some accounts say he was struck with a stabbing agony in his stomach. Others claimed he felt as if fire spread through his veins. His friends ran to him, asking what was wrong. He dismissed them with a wave. Just the wine, he said. Just fatigue. But was it? Historians now question everything about that moment. Was this the first sign of poisoning? Or simply his body failing after years of abuse? Poison was not unheard of in royal courts. Many believed his enemies had waited for the perfect moment, when he was relaxed, surrounded by friends, unguarded. Wine could be laced easily. Slow-acting poisons like arsenic could mimic illness. Some claimed the wine jug had been handled by unfamiliar servants that night. Others whispered that Medius himself had been seen exchanging looks with Cassander's men, Cassander, the son of Antipater, a man Alexander despised. Yet another mystery: some sources insist he had no sudden pain at all, that he drank peacefully and only fell ill the next morning. The contradictions are endless. Plutarch says one thing. Diodorus says another. The truth is lost in wine and shadows. But everyone agrees on one thing: that feast marked the beginning of the end. As the night went on, Alexander reportedly continued drinking, laughing one moment and weakening the next. He was carried to his chambers, still conscious but disturbed. He ordered that his campaign preparations continue. Even while trembling, he was planning another conquest. His generals watched him carefully. Some worried. Others waited. For to them, his death meant either opportunity, or chaos. Outside the palace, Babylon still roared with music. Dancers twirled, unaware that history was turning in silence behind closed doors. The torches flickered. The wine kept flowing. But for Alexander, the celebration was over. Within those palace walls, the greatest conqueror on earth had taken his last healthy breath. The banquet of glory had become the prologue of death. The morning after the great feast in Babylon, Alexander the Great did not rise with his usual vigor. He was no stranger to exhaustion. Years of relentless conquest had pushed his body past the limits of ordinary men, but this time, something was different. He felt a deep, burning fever spreading through him, as if the wine from the night before had turned into fire in his veins. Still, he refused to show weakness. He insisted on performing his daily duties, meeting with officers, issuing commands for the Arabian campaign he had already begun planning. He inspected the fleet that was being prepared on the Euphrates. He even continued supervising military logistics as if nothing were wrong. To his men, he appeared fatigued but determined. But those closest to him noticed his complexion had changed, his eyes sunken, his movements slower, his voice softer. That night, the fever worsened. His attendants recorded that Alexander felt chills despite the warm Babylonian air. He ordered blankets, then moments later threw them off in frustration. Sweat soaked his bedding. When his companions asked if he needed a physician, he waved the idea away. He was Alexander. Illness was for mortals. By the second day, his condition deteriorated. The fever climbed sharply, and his body trembled. Yet he still attended sacrifices to the gods, refusing to let the priests suspect anything was wrong. He performed rituals in honor of Apollo, perhaps seeking divine favor, or perhaps, in secret, fearing divine punishment. After the rituals, he shared a light meal but struggled to swallow. The soldiers watching from a distance whispered among themselves. Alexander had always appeared indestructible, but now he seemed human. On the third day, he was too weak to stand without aid. His generals visited him, urging him to rest. He insisted they continue military preparations as planned. He lay on his couch giving detailed orders, his voice strained yet clear. His mind remained sharp even as his body faltered. Some sources claim he summoned his commanders individually, as if quietly assessing their loyalty. Others say he refused to let anyone speak of death in his presence. That night, his fever became unbearable. He could barely move. His friends attempted to cool him with water and apply ointments, but nothing helped. Some suspected malaria. Others whispered it was typhoid. A few, more cynical, thought it was poison, slow, deliberate, precise. By the fourth day, his speech began to weaken. He could still talk, but only in brief sentences. His breath was shallow. His stomach churned, and sharp pains shot through his sides. Physicians were finally brought in, but their remedies were primitive: herbs, incense, oils, chants. None of it eased his suffering. Meanwhile, the army outside the palace grew restless. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he was resting. Others claimed he was dying. The generals tried to maintain order, but the soldiers demanded answers. The empire depended on one man's survival. Without him, everything could collapse. On the 5th day, Alexander could no longer leave his bed. Yet even in agony, he continued to issue commands. He ordered reports from every division. He signed documents with trembling hands. His willpower was unmatched, but will could not conquer sickness. Some accounts say he asked for water constantly, his throat dry as sand. Others state he was delirious, muttering about future conquests, calling out to companions who were not present. There were moments when he fell silent and stared into the distance, as if contemplating something beyond earthly concern. Perhaps he felt death approaching. Perhaps he was preparing to meet it as a king, or as a god. By the 6th day, speaking became nearly impossible. He could respond only with gestures, nodding, blinking, lifting a finger. His generals gathered around him, watching with unease. Some feared for him. Others feared what would come next. For years they had followed him in unity. But without him, they knew only chaos awaited. The physicians remained at his side, documenting his symptoms. They recorded that he still had his senses but could not communicate freely. His eyes moved with awareness. He was alive, fully conscious, but trapped in a failing body. On the 7th day, he was moved to the palace garden, placed beside the Euphrates River where the breeze could reach him. He lay silent, staring at the water. Soldiers gathered outside the courtyard walls, begging to see him. They feared he had already died. His generals hesitated. Showing him in such a weakened state could damage morale, but hiding him could spark revolt. Finally, a decision was made. The doors were opened. One by one, thousands of soldiers filed past him, silent, solemn. They did not cheer. They did not speak. They placed their weapons gently on the ground as a sign of respect. Alexander, unable to stand or speak, lifted his hand slowly in acknowledgement. Even at death's door, he greeted his men. Some wept openly. For the first time, they realized he was not invincible. The 8th and 9th days blurred together. His fever remained relentless. His body grew cold yet continued sweating. Some physicians believed he was nearing the end. Others still clung to hope. But one truth was clear, no remedy was working. Then came the moment that would shape centuries of speculation. According to the royal journal, on the 10th day, when asked to whom he left his empire, Alexander whispered, or perhaps mouthed, the words, "to the strongest." Others claim he simply handed his signet ring to Perdiccas, one of his generals, silently naming him successor. The accounts differ, but all agree, he did not appoint a clear heir. He left behind an empire too great to be ruled by one man, and a silence too dangerous to ignore. By the 11th day, he could no longer move at all. His breath slowed. His pulse weakened. His companions surrounded him. Some prayed. Others simply watched, unable to accept the reality. The greatest conqueror in history was slipping away, not on the battlefield, not by sword, but by something unseen. And then, quietly, he was gone. Or was he? For while ancient sources claim he died on that final day, others whisper that his body remained warm. That he showed no signs of decay. That his skin still glowed as if life lingered within. Was he truly dead, or trapped in silence? But that question would only grow louder in the days to come. For Alexander may have left the world, but the world was not ready to let him go. Alexander the Great's death has fascinated historians for centuries, not just for its drama, but for the mystery surrounding its cause. Was it a natural illness, the result of years of overwork and battle injuries? Or was it a deliberate act of murder, a slow-acting poison administered by someone close to him? Modern science and historical accounts collide in this section, as we attempt to dissect the possibilities, day by day, symptom by symptom. Ancient sources describe a man struck by fever, weakness, and paralysis. Plutarch and Arrian record his sudden inability to speak, his trembling limbs, and a mysterious lingering death over 11 days. For centuries, historians accepted typhoid fever as the most likely culprit. Typhoid, caused by bacteria, produces a high fever, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and sometimes delirium. The prolonged fever and his inability to eat could align with this theory. The Babylonians, with their cramped living quarters and limited sanitation, were susceptible to such infections. Yet many scholars argue that the timeline does not perfectly match typical typhoid cases. 11 days of illness with intermittent lucidity and awareness, combined with a sudden, dramatic decline, seems almost too theatrical to be entirely natural. Then there is malaria. Ancient Babylon was surrounded by marshes, a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. Malaria produces cycles of fever, chills, and fatigue, and it has been suggested that Alexander could have contracted it during his campaigns. Malaria is consistent with high fevers and weakness, but again, it does not fully account for his progressive paralysis and loss of speech. And no records mention the characteristic periodic chills, which would have been noted by eyewitnesses. Some researchers have even proposed more exotic modern diagnoses. Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune disorder, can cause sudden paralysis, sometimes following infection. Could Alexander have been stricken by a rare neurological illness that his physicians could not comprehend? The idea is compelling, yet impossible to confirm with the evidence available. Then comes the most sensational theory, poisoning. Ancient politics were brutal, and Alexander had no shortage of enemies. Arrian notes that some believed he was poisoned by a slow-acting substance over time, though he does not name a culprit. Modern historians debate whether arsenic, lead, or a mixture of herbs could have been used to mimic the symptoms of illness while remaining undetectable. Arsenic, for example, produces fever, vomiting, and gradual organ failure, sometimes over a week or more. Slow-acting poison would fit the narrative of a carefully orchestrated assassination, subtle, untraceable, and leaving no immediate evidence. Yet there are complications. Poison experts note that an effective dose strong enough to kill Alexander over 11 days would have required careful measurement. Too little, and it would not kill. Too much, and he would have died instantly, ruining the intrigue. Some argue it is improbable that anyone could have administered such a precise dose, especially during a chaotic banquet. Adding another layer of mystery, some historians suggest Alexander may not have been dead immediately. Reports indicate that his body did not decompose for several days after death, an anomaly that fueled legends of divinity. Could this have been a medical misdiagnosis, a comatose state mistaken for death? Ancient physicians lacked modern understanding of coma, paralysis, and fainting. If Alexander was buried alive, or embalmed while still barely alive, it would explain the strange reports of warmth and slight movement in his corpse. In recent years, forensic scholars have attempted reverse autopsies, comparing symptoms with known diseases and poisons. Typhoid fever remains the most widely accepted natural cause. Still, slow poisoning and neurological illness are impossible to rule out entirely. Even today, with centuries of historical accounts, modern medicine can only theorize. Each theory has supporters and detractors, and none can provide absolute certainty. What is clear is that Alexander's death was as dramatic and controversial as his life. Fever, paralysis, and weakness unfolded like a carefully staged play. His body became the center of political intrigue, and every symptom was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Was it a natural death? Or was it murder dressed as fate? The answer remains buried, just like the conqueror himself. Even more tantalizing is what happened after death. His body's strange resistance to decomposition gave rise to myths of divine intervention. Some accounts claimed he looked serene, untouched by decay. Others said his skin shimmered with a golden hue, further feeding the belief that gods themselves protected him. Whatever the truth, Alexander's death was transformed into legend almost immediately, leaving scientists, historians, and conspiracy theorists to debate the cause for over 2 millennia. In the end, this medical autopsy leaves us with more questions than answers. The fever, the paralysis, the inability to speak, and the strange preservation of his body all point to a man who died under mysterious circumstances. Whether by disease, poison, or some unknown neurological condition, Alexander's final days were a drama worthy of the man himself, a blend of human frailty and mythic storytelling. And as the empire waited in suspense, the question remained, who, if anyone, had the power to end the life of the world's greatest conqueror? The line between natural calamity and deliberate murder had blurred, setting the stage for the conspiracies that would dominate history long after Alexander's last breath. Death in a royal court is rarely simple, and Alexander the Great's final days were no exception. While some believed fever or disease claimed him, others whispered darker theories. Was this the natural end of a relentless conqueror, or a carefully orchestrated murder carried out by those who stood to gain the most? To understand the intrigue, one must examine the shadowy figures who surrounded him, the generals, the relatives, the ambitious courtiers, and the motives that may have driven them to strike at the heart of an empire. First, there was Cassander, son of Antipater, the regent of Macedonia. Cassander was ambitious and cunning, and his father had long navigated the treacherous politics of Alexander's court. Antipater and Alexander had a complicated relationship, sometimes cordial, sometimes tense. Cassander himself resented Alexander's attempts to centralize power and weaken Macedonian influence in favor of newly conquered territories. Some ancient sources claim that Cassander had both motive and opportunity, given the chaotic courtly events in Babylon. Could he have used the final banquet to slip a slow-acting poison into Alexander's wine? The theory is tempting, especially considering that after Alexander's death, Cassander moved quickly to consolidate power and eliminate potential rivals, including Alexander's unborn heir. Then there was Olympias, Alexander's mother. She was known for her intense devotion to her son and equally intense ruthlessness. She had spent decades maneuvering to protect her lineage, securing the throne for Alexander and ensuring Macedonia remained under her influence. After years of watching generals and advisors jockey for position, Olympias may have feared that Alexander's death, or incapacitation, could leave her family vulnerable. Some historians suggest that she may have played a subtle role in hastening his demise, ensuring that succession would favor her interests and those of her grandchildren. Her motive was simple: survival and legacy. Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian wife, is another figure shrouded in mystery. She was young, foreign, and fiercely protective of her unborn son, Alexander IV. In the volatile atmosphere of Babylon, she had reason to be fearful. If Alexander had fallen ill naturally, Roxana's future would be precarious, especially given the ambitions of the Macedonian generals. While there is no direct evidence that she acted against him, ancient whispers suggest that her alliances and fears could have indirectly influenced events surrounding his death. But perhaps the most complicated suspects were his generals, Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and others. They were loyal, yes, but loyalty in the time of Alexander was often transactional. Generals feared being sidelined in future campaigns or punished for past failures. Alexander's tendency to favor newer, foreign officers over his longtime Macedonian companions created tension. Some may have seen opportunity in his declining health. If Alexander were to die suddenly, those who controlled his body and succession plans could shape the empire to their advantage. Historian accounts even suggest that some generals stood watch during his final days, assessing his condition with keen interest, knowing that the man's passing could reshape their fates entirely. Then there is the theory of court intrigue itself, unseen, subtle manipulation rather than a single assassin. Ancient courts were rife with whispering conspiracies, false reports, and hidden machinations. Perhaps there was no single culprit. Perhaps multiple actors contributed to circumstances that accelerated his death. Poison could have been administered in small amounts over time, or the choice of physicians and treatments could have been deliberately mismanaged. Every action, or inaction, might have played a role. The combination of these potential actors created an atmosphere of paranoia. Alexander, aware of how many around him envied his power, may have suspected threats, yet he continued his routines. He ate, he drank, he met with advisors, perhaps oblivious to the silent plotting around him. Ancient historians describe him as unusually calm during his illness, suggesting either divine confidence or tragic ignorance of danger. Adding to the mystery is the timing of events after his illness began. Alexander's lack of a clear successor created a vacuum that his generals were quick to exploit. Even as he lay in bed, too weak to speak, the wheels of ambition were already turning. Alliances were formed in whispers, plans made in secret, and the stage was set for the chaos that would follow his death. Despite the intrigue, one truth is undeniable: Alexander's death did not occur in isolation. Every element, the banquet, the fever, the slow decline, became a theater in which ambition and survival played starring roles. Whether murder or misfortune, the outcome was the same: the greatest conqueror in history would leave a vast empire without a clear ruler, inviting betrayal, bloodshed, and political upheaval. And so, the question endures: was Alexander the victim of disease alone, or had someone, perhaps several someones, decided that the world's most powerful man should die in shadows? For centuries, historians have debated, and even today, the truth remains elusive, hidden behind layers of intrigue, fear, and ambition. The shadows that gathered around his bed in Babylon were not merely those of night, they were the shadows of empire, of loyalty and betrayal, and of men who would do anything to claim power once the god among men was gone. In the end, whether by poison, conspiracy, or chance, Alexander's death became inseparable from the web of ambition and fear that surrounded him. The conqueror had survived countless battles, endured deadly wounds, and triumphed over the world's greatest armies, but the quiet, insidious forces of the human heart may have finally bested him. And as the empire braced for the chaos to come, the names of the suspects would echo through history, a haunting reminder that even the mightiest of men are never beyond the reach of ambition. In the ancient world, death was never merely a biological event, it was a message from the divine. Alexander the Great, who claimed descent from Zeus himself, was no exception. For many in Babylon and across his vast empire, the sudden collapse of a man who had seemed invincible was not just shocking, it was terrifying. Could the gods themselves have turned against him? Had some ancient curse finally caught up to the man who had defied every boundary and conquered the known world? Alexander's own life was steeped in superstition and divine symbolism. From his youth, his mother Olympias insisted he was not merely a mortal prince but the son of Zeus. He nurtured this belief, often comparing himself to Achilles and Hercules, emulating their deeds, and expecting the world to recognize his divinity. When he conquered Egypt, he was crowned pharaoh and hailed as the son of Ammonius. Everywhere he went, he demanded obeisance, both to his person and to his destiny. Yet the closer he came to claiming ultimate power, the more the ancient world seemed to push back, reminding him that even gods could be punished. Babylon, where Alexander spent his final days, was a city of prophecy. Its temples and priests carried centuries of omens, warnings, and divine instructions. Some records suggest that Alexander had ignored several warnings from the Babylonian oracles, who advised him against entering the city. They spoke of doom, mysterious death, and the wrath of the gods should he overreach. While he had brushed off these warnings in his lifetime, after all, he had survived countless battles and dangerous expeditions, the legends tell us that fate has a way of catching up. Ancient historians note that some believed Alexander's death was divine retribution. He had desecrated temples, destroyed sacred cities, and claimed titles reserved for gods. He had pushed the limits of human ambition so far that it seemed inevitable, in the eyes of his contemporaries, that the gods would intervene. Plutarch records whispers among the court that Alexander's sudden illness was punishment for hubris. To those who feared the wrath of heaven, nothing less than divine justice could explain the fall of a man who had once appeared untouchable. But the curse narrative goes deeper than simple divine punishment. Some Babylonian priests and astrologers believed that the timing of Alexander's death aligned with ominous celestial configurations. The stars, they said, foretold the collapse of a ruler who had dared to claim dominion over lands sacred to multiple gods. In this worldview, illness and poison were not merely physical phenomena, they were instruments of fate, acting through natural means but guided by cosmic intent. Alexander's fever, paralysis, and decline were therefore interpreted as signs that the gods were reclaiming balance, punishing a mortal who aspired to immortality. Even among Alexander's Macedonian soldiers and generals, there was unease. He had defied death countless times in battle. He had survived injuries that should have killed him. He had led men through deserts, mountains, and rivers, often emerging victorious where others would have perished. And yet now, confined to a bed in Babylon, he was helpless. The contrast between his godlike persona and his frailty fueled rumors and superstitions. Soldiers whispered that the gods had finally caught up with him, delivering the ultimate judgment. Legends also speak of curses linked to his conquests. Cities he had destroyed, Tyre, Gaza, Thebes, were said to have invoked divine vengeance. Temples desecrated during campaigns, statues of gods toppled, and sacred sites plundered, all were thought to demand recompense. The timing of his death, shortly after his arrival in Babylon, seemed to some too coincidental to be chance. The idea that fate or a curse was at work added a layer of inevitability to his decline. Alexander was not merely dying, he was paying a cosmic debt. Yet not all ancient observers agreed. Some argued that Alexander's death had nothing to do with divine forces or curses and was purely human tragedy, disease, fatigue, and political tension. But even these rational explanations could not erase the widespread belief that gods were involved. In an age when the line between the natural and the supernatural was fluid, even physicians, generals, and advisors could not escape the shadow of divine interpretation. Ultimately, the idea of divine justice or a curse elevated Alexander's death from an ordinary mortality to something mythic. It framed his end as a lesson for all who would seek too much power. It suggested that the world, even one he had conquered, was not entirely under his control. The gods, it seemed, still held sway, and even a man who called himself a son of Zeus could not escape their judgment. As historians and storytellers would later reflect, this belief in divine retribution transformed Alexander's death into a moral narrative as much as a historical event. It allowed people to rationalize what otherwise seemed inexplicable, the sudden collapse of a man who had bent empires to his will. Whether or not there was a curse, the myth endures. Alexander's final days were not only a medical mystery or political crisis, they were a cautionary tale of ambition, hubris, and the fragile line between godhood and mortality. In the end, the whispers of divine punishment remind us that in Alexander's time, death was never just an ending, it was a message. And for the man who sought to be immortal, it was perhaps the ultimate reminder that no power, however vast, could escape the unseen forces that governed the world. Death in ancient times was never a private affair, and for Alexander the Great, it became a spectacle unlike any the world had seen. His passing in Babylon did not merely mark the end of a life, it set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of an empire and redefine power itself. And yet, paradoxically, the greatest funeral in history, one worthy of a god, never truly occurred as intended. When Alexander's body finally succumbed to illness, or poison, his attendants discovered something extraordinary. Despite days of high fever and near paralysis, the corpse appeared remarkably preserved. The skin retained warmth, the muscles had not collapsed, and there were no signs of decomposition. To his contemporaries, this was miraculous. Was it divine intervention? Had the gods themselves ensured their son's passage into legend? In the eyes of his generals and the Babylonian populace, Alexander's death was no ordinary demise. It demanded an extraordinary funeral. Preparations for the funeral began immediately. Babylonian custom called for elaborate rites, sacrifices, and a procession worthy of kings. Plans were made to transport the body back to Macedonia, where a grand tomb awaited, one that would honor the conqueror's life and cement his immortality. Yet these plans quickly became entangled in politics, ambition, and greed. For Alexander's death created a vacuum of power, and those who controlled his body would control the legitimacy of his succession. Enter Ptolemy, one of Alexander's trusted generals and future founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. According to historical accounts, Ptolemy saw an opportunity in the chaos surrounding Alexander's corpse. By taking possession of the body, he could claim authority, strengthen his position, and align himself with the legacy of the world's greatest conqueror. The plan was audacious: intercept the funeral procession and reroute Alexander's body to Egypt, away from Macedonia and the generals who might challenge his influence. The caravan carrying Alexander's corpse was massive, guarded by soldiers and attended by priests and officials. Yet even with such precautions, it became a target of political maneuvering. Ambushes were avoided, but rumors abound of near confrontations. Generals who had once sworn loyalty now weighed the advantages of controlling the body themselves. Every mile the procession traveled, intrigue followed. Each stop became a stage for negotiation, deception, and quiet threats. Meanwhile, in Babylon, the empire was beginning to fracture. Macedonian officers debated who should inherit power, while courtiers whispered of curses and divine wrath. Alexander's mother, Olympias, demanded influence over the funeral arrangements to secure her grandson's future. Roxana, his wife, maneuvered to protect her unborn child's inheritance. Every faction understood that whoever controlled the body controlled legitimacy. The corpse, in essence, was more valuable than gold or land; it was the key to the empire itself. Accounts describe lavish funerary rituals intended to honor Alexander's supposed divinity. Sacred fires burned, incense filled the air, and sacrifices were made to both Macedonian and Babylonian gods. Yet the grandeur was constantly interrupted by political scheming. The ceremonial rites became a theater of tension, as generals, priests, and family members jostled for influence. The intended funeral in Macedonia, promised to glorify the conqueror in his homeland, never materialized as planned. Instead, it was hijacked mid-journey, turning what should have been a singular, historic event into a complicated, drawn-out struggle over control. The journey to Egypt was long and arduous. Alexander's body was placed on a golden bier, adorned with royal regalia and divine symbols, as if to reinforce the belief that he had transcended mortality. Soldiers marched beside the corpse, keeping a vigilant watch. Local populations watched silently, both in awe and fear, unsure whether they were witnessing a mortal man or a god walking among them for the last time. The political tension was palpable. Every turn of the caravan brought uncertainty about who might attempt to seize the body. Finally, after weeks of careful travel and negotiation, Ptolemy succeeded in securing Alexander's body in Egypt. The tomb in Alexandria, though magnificent, was not the planned resting place in Macedonia, and thus the funeral that would have united the empire around his memory was never realized. What was intended as a display of a unified empire paying homage to a god-king instead became a symbol of division, intrigue, and political cunning. This funeral that never happened had consequences that rippled through history. By diverting Alexander's body, Ptolemy established himself as a legitimate ruler in Egypt, laying the foundation for the Ptolemaic dynasty. Meanwhile, Macedonia and the rest of the empire descended into chaos, as rival generals and factions vied for power. The death of a single man, though extraordinary, was eclipsed by the wars, assassinations, and betrayals that followed. Alexander's passing, like his life, left the world in upheaval. And yet, the legend endured. The story of his preserved body, the stolen funeral, and the grandeur of the ceremonies captured imaginations for centuries. People did not just remember that Alexander had died, they remembered the drama surrounding his death. The corpse itself became a tool of political power, a symbol of divine authority, and a focal point of ambition. In this way, the greatest funeral in history, though never fully realized, left a mark as lasting as any battlefield conquest. Alexander's death may have been inevitable, but the handling of his body transformed mortality into myth. The funeral that never happened became an enduring lesson. Even in death, power is a force to be contested, and even gods among men are subject to human greed, intrigue, and ambition. The conqueror had passed, but the struggle for his legacy had only just begun. Alexander the Great may have died, but his death did not bring peace. On the contrary, it unleashed one of the most ruthless and unusual conflicts in history, a war fought not for land, wealth, or armies, but for the body of a man who had once conquered the known world. In the ancient world, the possession of a king's corpse was more than symbolic. It was a claim to legitimacy, a tangible connection to divine authority, and a tool for controlling empires. And Alexander's generals, all ambitious and seasoned in bloodshed, understood this better than anyone. The moment Alexander's body was secured in Egypt by Ptolemy, chaos erupted across the empire. Macedonia, Thrace, Persia, and beyond were left without a clear successor. Alexander had no adult heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant with Alexander IV, who would never hold power without guardianship and military support. The generals, now called the Diadochi, faced a choice: respect the unborn child, or seize power for themselves. The corpse, glowing with a divine aura and preserved beyond natural expectation, became the ultimate bargaining chip. Immediately, rivalries ignited. Perdiccas, Alexander's appointed regent, sought to maintain control of the empire in the name of Alexander IV. But his authority was contested by Antipater in Macedonia, Ptolemy in Egypt, and Seleucus in the eastern provinces. Each general understood that whoever held Alexander's body could claim moral and spiritual legitimacy. To the soldiers and subjects of the empire, reverence for the deceased conqueror was intertwined with obedience. Possession of the corpse could turn men's loyalty in favor of one general over another. The struggle was brutal and often violent. Armies maneuvered across vast territories, not just to capture cities, but to intercept funeral processions and secure the body. Even minor skirmishes were magnified because control over Alexander's remains meant control over the perception of divine authority. When Ptolemy moved Alexander's body to Memphis and later Alexandria, he did so under heavy guard, anticipating that rivals might attempt to intercept it. Each step was fraught with tension, for the slightest miscalculation could spark rebellion or civil war. Meanwhile, back in Macedonia, Olympias and her allies worked to protect the interests of her family. Roxana's child was targeted by rival factions, eventually murdered in the bloody campaigns that followed. Alexander's second wife, Statira, was also killed by political rivals seeking to remove potential claims to the throne. The struggle for a corpse quickly evolved into a war for survival, inheritance, and dominance. In a matter of months, the empire Alexander had built from Greece to India was fractured into competing territories ruled by generals more concerned with power than loyalty. The war for Alexander's body also transformed the meaning of death itself. In most conflicts, victory was measured by territory or treasure. In this case, victory hinged on reverence and symbolism. Generals transported the body on golden litters, displayed it to troops, and invoked the image of Alexander as a god to ensure loyalty. Soldiers swore allegiance not only to their commander but to the corpse itself. Tales of Alexander's preserved body spread rapidly, enhancing his myth and creating psychological leverage over armies. Beyond military tactics, the struggle had profound political consequences. The Diadochi divided the empire into regions, each ruled independently but nominally acknowledging Alexander's legacy. Ptolemy's control of the corpse allowed him to establish Alexandria as a center of power, the Ptolemaic dynasty, and a lasting connection to Alexander's legend. Seleucus established his own dominion in the east, using loyalty to the deceased conqueror to legitimize his rule. Macedonia, the heartland of the empire, saw repeated revolts and assassinations as generals jockeyed for influence over troops and territories. The war for a corpse also exposed the fragility of empires built around a single individual. Alexander had conquered through charisma, military genius, and personal authority. But his sudden death revealed that no matter how vast an empire, the absence of a strong, universally recognized successor left it vulnerable to collapse. The Diadochi Wars, sparked in part by control of the corpse, lasted for decades, reshaping the political landscape of the ancient world. Territories that had once been unified under a single ruler became separate kingdoms, each tracing legitimacy back to the man whose body they venerated. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this war is its human cost. Thousands of soldiers died in battles over Alexander's remains. Civilian populations were terrorized as armies moved across the empire. Families of potential heirs were slaughtered to eliminate competition. The struggle was not merely symbolic, it was violent, calculated, and merciless. Alexander's death, which might have marked the end of conquest, instead triggered a chain reaction of bloodshed and betrayal that reshaped history. Yet, amid all the chaos, the corpse remained central. Alexander's body was more than a symbol, it was a tool, a prize, and a weapon. Whoever controlled it could claim divine favor, inspire loyalty, and influence politics. It became clear that, for the ancient world, mortality was intertwined with power. Death was never merely an ending, it was the beginning of a new struggle, one where the dead could wield authority as effectively as the living. In retrospect, the war for Alexander's corpse illustrates the paradox of his life and death. He had conquered lands, armies, and peoples, yet in the end, it was his death, and his preserved body, that commanded the fiercest battles. The greatest general in history had survived countless wars, faced impossible odds, and bested the mightiest armies of Persia and India. But in the absence of his living presence, his corpse became the ultimate prize, a reminder that even gods among men are not beyond the reach of human ambition, greed, and bloodshed. And so, while Alexander's life was legendary, it was his death that truly demonstrated the raw and dangerous power of symbols. His body, caught in the crossfire of generals and dynasties, became the centerpiece of a war that would define the future of the ancient world. In death, Alexander continued to conquer, not territories, but hearts, minds, and empires, shaping history long after his final breath. Alexander the Great had dreamed of an empire without borders, a world united under his vision of Hellenistic culture. Yet his death in Babylon, sudden and enigmatic, left that dream incomplete. What remained was a vast, sprawling dominion stretching from Greece to India, teeming with wealth, armies, and restless populations, but with no ruler capable of holding it together. The immediate aftermath of his passing marked the beginning of one of the most tumultuous periods in ancient history, the fragmentation of Alexander's empire and the rise of chaos that would shape the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world for generations. The first sign of instability was clear in Macedonia. While Alexander lay in his deathbed, generals and advisors jockeyed for position, unsure of who would command the loyalty of the army and the Macedonian people. Perdiccas, Alexander's appointed regent, attempted to assert control over the empire in the name of the unborn heir, Alexander IV. Yet his authority was fragile. Antipater in Macedonia, a seasoned statesman and strategist, challenged Perdiccas's power, arguing that the Macedonian heartland required strong, immediate leadership. With Alexander's central authority gone, competing factions quickly formed, each claiming legitimacy based on their proximity to the late king, their military command, or their connection to Macedonian nobility. The generals, collectively known as the Diadochi, faced an impossible task. Alexander's empire was not a unified state in the modern sense but a coalition of territories bound by personal loyalty to its leader. Without him, there was no shared vision or centralized system of governance. Instead, there were armies, satraps, and cities accustomed to reporting directly to the conqueror himself. The sudden vacuum created not only rivalry but also fear, as each leader realized that failure to secure territory and troops could mean their death, or exile. In the east, the situation was even more precarious. Persian territories, recently conquered and nominally loyal to Alexander, began to question their allegiance. Satraps and governors, who had enjoyed a degree of autonomy under the Macedonian system, sensed opportunity. Revolts erupted in some regions, while others declared loyalty to whichever general could project strength. Alexander's absence was a shock to both the conquered populations and his own commanders. For the first time, the carefully maintained illusion of invincibility was shattered. Ptolemy, who had secured Alexander's corpse and established control in Egypt, quickly consolidated his position. By invoking his association with Alexander, he legitimized his rule in the eyes of soldiers and civilians alike. Alexandria became a power center, attracting loyalists and scholars, and laying the foundation for the Ptolemaic dynasty. In a sense, Ptolemy transformed a death into political capital, demonstrating that Alexander's influence extended beyond life itself. His success, however, further fragmented the empire, as other generals sought similar advantages, each claiming legitimacy through association, conquest, or control of strategic locations. Meanwhile, Seleucus moved eastward, taking command of territories in Persia and Mesopotamia. He, too, leveraged the prestige of Alexander's name to win loyalty, promising stability and continuity. Over time, the eastern satraps fell under his control, but not without resistance. Each military maneuver, each negotiation, was shadowed by the knowledge that the empire's cohesion rested on fragile trust. The Diadochi were forced to navigate a complex web of allegiance, ambition, and fear, each decision a gamble with potentially catastrophic consequences. The chaos extended beyond politics and armies, it seeped into everyday life. Cities that had once celebrated Alexander's conquests now experienced uncertainty. Trade networks faltered as regions realigned under new rulers. Local populations, unsure who would govern them, faced increased taxation, conscription, and occasional violence. Religious institutions, which had flourished under Alexander's policy of incorporating local gods alongside Greek deities, began to realign with whichever general controlled the area. Babylon, the site of his death, became a center of intrigue, its streets echoing with rumors of conspiracies, shifting loyalties, and the fate of the legendary corpse. Perhaps the most significant consequence of Alexander's death was the fate of his heirs. Roxana's son, Alexander IV, was born posthumously, but his legitimacy was contested from the start. With multiple generals vying for power, he became a pawn in a dangerous game. Olympias, his grandmother, attempted to protect him, but she could not prevent his eventual assassination. The empire's stability hinged on the presence of a strong leader, and without Alexander, there was none. The vast territories he had conquered, unified under his personal authority, fractured almost immediately into smaller, often warring kingdoms. The Diadochis Wars lasted decades, shaping the political and cultural landscape of the Hellenistic world. Macedonia, Egypt, and the eastern provinces became separate dynasties, each claiming continuity with Alexander's legacy. The dream of a unified world under a single ruler dissolved, replaced by competing kingdoms whose borders shifted with every battle. Yet, paradoxically, Alexander's death ensured that his influence persisted. The generals used his name, his body, and his memory as tools to legitimize their rule, spreading Hellenistic culture across regions that had once been entirely foreign to Greece. Alexander's passing thus became both an ending and a beginning. The empire he built disintegrated into chaos, but the spread of Greek culture, language, and governance continued in new forms. Cities founded in his name, like Alexandria, became cultural hubs for centuries. His image as a godlike figure inspired loyalty, fear, and ambition, ensuring that even in death, he shaped the political and social structures of the known world. In the final analysis, Alexander's death exposed the vulnerability inherent in empires built around a single charismatic leader. His life had been extraordinary, filled with conquest and ambition, but it was also fragile, dependent on personal authority and the devotion of his army. Once that authority vanished, the empire's cohesion crumbled, leaving behind chaos, war, and uncertainty. Yet, even in fragmentation, Alexander's shadow loomed large. His name, deeds, and even his corpse continued to influence the world, proving that while his empire was interrupted, his legacy was eternal. The story of Alexander's death and the empire in chaos serves as a profound reminder: conquest may build empires, but the absence of a visionary leader can unravel them. Alexander achieved immortality through both glory and myth, but the human consequences of his absence were severe, leaving a trail of war, betrayal, and ambition that would define the Hellenistic world for generations to come. Even after his physical death, Alexander the Great lived on, not just in memory, but in myth. Stories of his divine ancestry, extraordinary conquests, and mysterious demise transformed him into a figure that transcended history, blending fact, legend, and the imagination of generations. Across the Mediterranean, the Near East, and Asia, tales of Alexander circulated, evolving into myths that made him both immortal and inscrutable. His death in Babylon became a central chapter in a life that history would never forget. From the moment his corpse was secured in Egypt, reports of its extraordinary preservation fueled speculation. Witnesses claimed that the body did not decay as expected, that it glowed with an almost divine radiance, and that his eyes seemed to retain a spark of life. Some interpreted this as evidence of godhood, others as a sign of fate's hand. Stories circulated that Alexander's soul had ascended or that his body could not truly die because of the heroic feats he had accomplished. These accounts blurred the line between history and mythology, elevating him to a quasi-divine status. In the Greek world, Alexander's image was carefully cultivated. Sculptors, painters, and poets depicted him as a heroic figure, combining mortal traits with godlike perfection. Coins were minted bearing his likeness, not merely as a ruler but as a symbol of divine authority. In the centuries that followed, these images reinforced the narrative that Alexander was no ordinary man. He was an exemplar of ambition, courage, and the human desire to transcend mortality. The notion that he had been touched by the gods, and that the gods had perhaps judged him in death, captivated the imaginations of those who never witnessed his campaigns firsthand. In the East, Persian and Indian stories told of Alexander in ways that reflected local perspectives. Some viewed him as a destructive conqueror, a bringer of chaos whose death was divine retribution. Others celebrated him as a powerful foreign king who changed the course of history and culture. The diversity of these legends reflects the duality of Alexander's life, both hero and villain, conqueror and destroyer. His death, enigmatic and dramatic, became a lens through which entire cultures interpreted his influence. Religious interpretations also emerged. In Egypt, priests associated Alexander with the god Ammonius, reinforcing the notion that he was a divine son. In Babylon, scribes and astrologers linked his demise to celestial omens, embedding his death within cosmic significance. Even in Greece and Macedonia, philosophers debated the morality of his actions, the role of fate, and the intersection of human ambition and divine will. Across regions, the stories surrounding Alexander's death transformed it into a teaching narrative, a cautionary tale about hubris, ambition, and the limits of human power. Over time, the myths became more elaborate. Legends arose that Alexander had not truly died but had been hidden away, traveling to distant lands in secret or achieving immortality through mystical means. Other tales suggested that he had been resurrected by the gods, returning to continue his campaigns in a spiritual realm. These stories, while historically unverifiable, demonstrate the enduring fascination with his persona. The combination of his accomplishments, dramatic final days, and mysterious death created fertile ground for imagination. The preservation of his body, whether miraculous or exaggerated, played a central role in these legends. It symbolized the tension between mortality and eternity, between human vulnerability and godlike ambition. To the ancient world, a body that defied decay was proof of exceptional destiny. Alexander's preserved corpse became both a literal and metaphorical artifact, a reminder of his power, a tool of political legitimacy, and a focal point for myth-making. The generals who fought over it unwittingly contributed to his immortal status, as every retelling emphasized the extraordinary nature of both his life and his death. Even after the empire fragmented, Alexander's name retained authority. Hellenistic rulers across Egypt, Syria, and the eastern territories invoked his legacy to legitimize their own reigns. They built cities in his name, minted coins bearing his visage, and patronized scholars who preserved his story. Each act reinforced the myth of Alexander, ensuring that even as his physical empire dissolved, his cultural and symbolic influence endured. His death, rather than diminishing him, amplified his legend, transforming a mortal man into a timeless icon. Stories of Alexander's final days, his mysterious illness, his prolonged decline, the contested funeral, and the war over his corpse, became central to these myths. They provided narrative drama, moral lessons, and political utility. Ancient historians, poets, and philosophers drew upon these events to explore questions of destiny, mortality, and ambition. The interplay of fact and myth ensured that each retelling carried both historical insight and symbolic meaning. Alexander's death was no longer just an event, it was a story that defined an era. In the centuries that followed, Alexander's legend inspired empires, military leaders, and storytellers alike. From Roman generals seeking to emulate his campaigns to medieval chroniclers recounting his exploits, his life and death became templates for heroism, leadership, and ambition. Even today, the fascination with Alexander's final days, his mysterious illness, the contested funeral, and the myths surrounding his corpse, continues to captivate historians, scholars, and enthusiasts around the world. Ultimately, Alexander's death demonstrates the power of narrative. While the historical record provides glimpses of illness, political intrigue, and military consequences, it is the myths that ensured his immortality. Death, in his case, was not an ending but a transformation, converting human achievement into legend. The conqueror's body may have lain in a tomb, but his story continued to travel, inspiring awe, fear, and fascination for millennia. Alexander the Great had achieved something extraordinary. He had become eternal, not merely through conquest, but through the stories that outlived him. His final days, shrouded in mystery and drama, remind us that history is not just a chronicle of events, it is also a canvas for imagination, interpretation, and myth-making. Alexander's death was a beginning, a narrative that would define the ancient world, influence culture, and remind generations that the line between mortality and legend is often drawn by those who tell the story. The death of Alexander the Great was more than a historical event, it was a lesson in the fragility of power, the unpredictability of human ambition, and the enduring influence of legend. Across empires, cultures, and centuries, his passing served as a cautionary tale. No matter how vast one's conquests or how invincible one appears, mortality, and the consequences of human decisions, remains unavoidable. By examining the final days of the conqueror, historians and storytellers alike glean insights into leadership, legacy, and the perilous interplay between destiny and human action. One of the most immediate lessons lies in the nature of succession. Alexander's empire was built around a single man's charisma, intellect, and military genius. From Macedonia to India, governors, soldiers, and subject populations obeyed him personally rather than following institutional systems. His death revealed a critical vulnerability. The absence of a clear and robust succession plan left an empire ripe for division. The resulting wars of the Diadochi, the murders of heirs, and the fragmentation of territories demonstrate that even the mightiest empires can collapse almost instantly without a stable framework for continuity. Leadership, it seems, is only as enduring as the institutions that support it. The second lesson concerns the role of ambition and human nature. Alexander's generals, once loyal companions and comrades in arms, immediately turned their focus from honoring their fallen leader to securing power for themselves. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antipater, and others exploited the chaos, maneuvering politically and militarily to expand their own influence. The intense struggle over Alexander's corpse exemplifies how ambition can transform respect into rivalry, even in the wake of shared grief. History shows that the pursuit of power is often indifferent to morality. Alexander's death merely accelerated what might have otherwise taken decades to unfold. There is also a profound lesson in the limits of human control. Alexander had conquered territory spanning continents, reformed armies, and reshaped cultures. Yet his death, whether from fever, poison, or a mysterious neurological condition, was beyond his control. It underscores the idea that no amount of genius or planning can ultimately prevent the inevitabilities of life. Even the most disciplined and strategic leaders must confront the unpredictable forces of nature, illness, and circumstance. Alexander's final days, marked by physical decline and political uncertainty, remind us that mortality is the great equalizer, sparing neither kings nor commoners. The intertwining of myth and reality in his death offers another important insight. From the preserved body to the contested funeral, from whispered curses to divine retribution, the narrative surrounding Alexander's passing illustrates the power of story. Legends amplified his accomplishments, reinforced his authority, and extended his influence far beyond his lifetime. This duality, historical fact intertwined with myth, demonstrates that how events are remembered can be as influential as the events themselves. Leaders and civilizations that harness narrative effectively can shape perception, inspire loyalty, and leave enduring legacies long after physical control fades. Alexander's death also provides a lesson in the consequences of unchecked ambition. His relentless pursuit of conquest brought enormous wealth, cultural exchange, and military achievement, but it also created conditions for instability after his passing. Empires built on personal dominance rather than shared governance or institutional stability are inherently fragile. The wars, betrayals, and assassinations that followed Alexander's death were not merely tragic, they were predictable outcomes of an empire overly dependent on one individual's vision. This principle echoes through history, offering insight for leaders, policymakers, and strategists even today. The human cost of his death further reinforces the peril of centralized authority. Civilian populations, soldiers, and heirs alike suffered as power struggles erupted across the empire. The assassination of Alexander IV, the murder of Roxana, and the battles between generals highlight the collateral damage inherent in political vacuums. Ambition, loyalty, and fear collided violently, showing that the death of a single influential figure can ripple outward, impacting countless lives and reshaping societies. Leadership, therefore, is inseparable from responsibility, particularly in the moments when authority is most vulnerable. Beyond politics and warfare, Alexander's death teaches a lesson about legacy. While his empire fractured, his cultural and symbolic influence endured. Cities like Alexandria became centers of learning, trade, and Hellenistic culture. Coins, sculptures, and written accounts preserved his image, while myths ensured that even those unfamiliar with his campaigns recognized his name. Alexander's life and death exemplify the concept that influence is not measured solely by territory or conquest but also by the enduring power of ideas, culture, and story. Legacy, in other words, can survive where empires do not. Finally, there is a philosophical lesson embedded in his story, the delicate balance between human ambition and fate. Alexander's life was extraordinary, yet his death was inevitable. The tension between the man's extraordinary achievements and the ordinary realities of mortality invites reflection on the limits of human power. Leaders, conquerors, and ordinary individuals alike can draw meaning from his story. Striving for greatness requires vision and courage, but recognition of mortality and contingency remains essential. Alexander's final days remind us that ambition, when unchecked by preparation and prudence, can leave even the greatest legacies vulnerable to disruption. In conclusion, the death of Alexander the Great serves as a multidimensional lesson. It illustrates the fragility of empires built around single leaders, the relentless nature of ambition, the unpredictable force of mortality, and the enduring power of narrative. It exposes the human costs of power struggles while also highlighting the potential for legacy to transcend death itself. From the medical mysteries of his illness to the political wars for his corpse, from divine interpretations to enduring myths, his final days offer insight not only into ancient history but also into timeless truths about leadership, ambition, and the human condition. Alexander's passing was not merely the end of a life, it was a prism through which the complexity of human power, mortality, and memory can be understood. By studying the drama, mystery, and aftermath of his death, we are reminded that even the greatest conquerors are mortal, that legacies are fragile yet enduring, and that history itself is as much about interpretation as it is about fact. In death, Alexander taught lessons as profound and enduring as those he imparted in life, reminders of the price of ambition, the power of myth, and the ever-present shadow of mortality over even the most extraordinary of men.